I want to begin this afternoon by saying Chimigwich, Marci, Merci to all of the organizers and for the invitation to speak today. I want to begin by bringing forth the long-standing historical tension between Anglophones and Francophones. As many of you know from personal experience, that Canada is fraught with this narrative, which continues to play out in different discursive formations. Within my own personal history of Anishinaabe, Métis, French, Syrian, and German, I was born and raised speaking English. Do I long for a knowledge in French, Michif, or Anishinaabe-Moan? Of course, I feel a sense of loss through language and the colonial tactics that have prevented me the right to know these languages. But what I want everybody to leave here thinking about today is the historical narrative situated in the construction of Canada, the politics of Quebec, and the key fact that everyone who is living in or arriving to North America or Turtle Island are situated within Indigenous territory, regardless if it is ceded, unceded, with title, without title, with treaty. We must remember to acknowledge the specific place we are standing on, and it will always be Haudenosaunee and Algonquin territory. I feel that my work as a researcher, scholar, and artist is to reveal the ontology of the land, which contains memory, knowledge, and living histories. In urban spaces such as Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, and Winnipeg, there's a reluctance to name the occupation of space. That is, regardless if your family came here 400 years ago or 4 years ago, you are settlers or newcomers that occupy a colonial space. Cities such as Toronto, Montreal, Winnipeg, they are replicas of the imperial heart, where you can still hear faint beats of Indigenous memory throughout the space. The embodied knowledge of many Indigenous people within the cityscape becomes part of their ability to read or see the terrain. The memory of the land and the past people that were part of it can be felt and embodied. In this talk, I'm going to discuss some past research which brings forth the concealed geographies of the city of Toronto and the examination of 3 Indigenous artists. Rebecca Belmore, Jeff Thomas, Robert Houle are creating artwork that represents a part of their embodied practice and knowledge. Later in the talk, I'm going to reflect on some installations of non-Indigenous artists such as Phil Hoffman, Patricio Davila, Dave Colangelo, Jenny Suddick, and Indigenous artists Jeff Thomas, Maria Hupfield, Terence Houle, and myself in the exhibition Landslide Possible Futures, curated by Dr. Janine Marcia. I will argue that the above artists attempt to create a dialogue in order to transform the narratives of history, heritage, culture, archaeology, and geography to imagine the possibility of space. And today, I think, and yesterday, we've seen more of the hard parts of, or the devastation. And so what I think I'm advocating here for is the possibility to think or to dream of something beyond the tragedy. My research and practice are grounded in the principal idea that art can create the epistemological, critical, and phenomenological conditions to critically analyze and challenge officially constructed linear histories with stories of place by directly engaging in a dialogue with archaeology and geography. In this past scholarship, I've demonstrated the importance of creating an alternative cartography that visually ruptures the colonial master narrative of Canada. I've argued that spatial acts have serious and material consequences for Indigenous people. Bellmore, Houle, and Thomas are rising to the challenge and confronting practices of subjugation to build place-based critiques through their artwork to recreate, reimagine Indigenous relationships to space. These artists are remapping with their body, knowledge, and visual images to bring forth the concealed Indigenous stories of place. The 3 artists I've selected because their artwork is connected to land, history, and knowledge. Houle's work focuses on the actual space and the histories of the land through the relationship of water. Bellmore's work is wrapped in the body and how the body is tied to particular histories of colonialism. And Jeff Thomas's work is creating a new narrative of the visual mapping of Indigenous people into urban places. I've selected these artists because their work is strongly linked to Indigenous cosmology. Indigenous people map and divide the world into distinct zones through cosmology. This worldview is grounded in the idea that space is experienced in specific relations to configurations of land, sky, and water. The specifics of cosmology in each region affect and reflect upon particular environments and ecologies. I'm drawing on the Anishinaabe cosmology that relies on the central axis of the line and situates the bottom as the water or the underground, the middle as the land or the human relationship to land, and the top as the sky or the above ground. These artists reflect the three layers of the cosmos. Their work represents the vertical line. The water or underground, which you see some of Robert Houle's work, is based in that area. Rebecca Belmore's work with the land and her body is the middle, and the sky is Jeff Thomas's aerial photographs of the city of Toronto. Each of the artists' work reflects on different areas and brings different knowledge of to each place. For my research on Soto artist Robert Houle, I've focused on a series of projects from 1997. With the exception of the Teamway, which is located at York Street Gateway, all of the works remain untitled. Houle's project was created in conjunction with 5 urban designers and was funded by the City of Toronto. The overall purpose of the projects was to map the cityscape through the Garrison Creek tributary, the Don River, and smaller tributaries that run along Yonge and York Street, feeding into Lake Ontario. In this investigation, I have asserted that Robert Houle's stories in his artworks are reaffirming Indigenous ties to space and are further centered in concepts of native and alternative sovereign spaces within the City of Toronto. Native space can be understood as a network of relations akin to those traditionally navigated over waterways and across land. I've specifically chosen artworks by Robert Houle because he has placed the waterways and the land in the forefront, and these visual images specifically disrupt the constructed settler grid. I've argued that this work has produced an imaginary temporal space that has allowed for a transformative dialogue to take place in the city. I'm committed to the idea that this dialogue formed by the artworks attempts to dismantle the colonizer-colonized split into a transformative space by offering multiple narratives within Indigenous stories of place. This transformative space can allow for a person to interact with Houle's artwork without playing into the binary of the colonial roles. It enables the viewer the ability to explore Indigenous stories of place, and the most important element of these artworks is based on their power to reclaim the area as an Indigenous sovereign space by using the visual narrative that is located within Indigenous self-histories that are tied to concepts of native space. I have argued in the past that Anishinaabe artist Rebecca Belmore's work is part of the living archive, which is performing cultural memory and employing as telling as part of an embodied experience and a political act. Her performance is creating, recording, and storing Indigenous stories of place. The performances I've focused on were Vigil, The Named and the Unnamed in Vancouver, 2001 and 2013, Gone Indian in Toronto in 2009. In that performance was with also Michael Bellmore, or sorry, not Michael Bellmore, that's her brother. My apologies, Michael Grey Eyes was her collaborator in that piece. And then Wild in 2001. All of these performances confront the colonial gaze. The colonial gaze builds on the work of Alison Blunt and Gillian Rose in the imperial gaze. They argue to emphasize the imperial gaze highlights the visual and or textual politics of representation and location. For me, the colonial gaze takes into consideration the psychoaffective condition of Fanon, of the colonized person, and understands that Aboriginal women's body and land are objects of colonization. And as we saw in Caroline's presentation, which was very evident, Bellmore's performances interpret history through an Anishinaabe perspective and are rooted in the ideology of native space. This ideology challenges the dominant Canadian narrative that is intrinsically linked to settler mythologies in the occupation of space. Her ability to use her body as a tool to shift the colonial gaze to a space that can communicate the link to land and Indigenous histories. The selected performances of Bellmore's body create a visual and embodied text that confronts the viewer with Canada's violent colonial history. Her actions, her embodied practice confront these implications in Canada, which is colonized, racialized, and gendered. Indigenous bodies have material consequences in the politics of recognition and sovereignty because their bodies hold these concealed geographies. These histories and knowledges are erased and objectified, which limits the ability of Indigenous people to give place-based critiques and apply theories of respatialization. I argue the performance and installation work of Rebecca Belmore builds on a geographic imagination that remaps the city through the presence of her gendered colonial body. This presence can shift the colonial gaze to challenge settler ideologies in the occupation of space and through these stories of place. I've established that the politics of visual representation are confined by the lack of sight of the native body, which further perpetuates settler mythologies in the occupation of place. I've argued these myths are bound to the objectification of the colonized gendered body because it relies on the idea that the female native body is to be tamed and controlled. The female body is constrained to land, bodies, and the minds of the colonizer, and I am advocating for thinking of the possibility of space outside of transparent space as a dream without boundaries where the native body can be seen. Bellmore's artwork represents an Indigenous presence by remarking and reascribing the cityscape as a native space. Her creative work transforms the living history of Indigenous people by performing cultural memory. She allows for the native body to be present by using her own body's visual image to react, re-remember, and reimagine the landscape, history, and Indigenous knowledges that continue to create a living archive. Haudenosaunee artist Jeff Thomas's photographs, he's not up yet, but is Indians Go on Tour, 2005, Indian Camp by Paul Kane at the ROM, 2006, and selected images from the artist's personal collection. I argue that these images build on an alternative cartography that maps the visual terrain through each photograph to convey different stories of place. This map would propose an alternative cartography that would be situated in Indigenous stories in place in comparison to a traditional cartography that produces a map and marks the space via mapping and surveying and owning the land. Indigenous stories of place are part of the history of the land, which are grounded in an embodied knowledge and concealed geographies and oral histories. This alternative cartography could create the possibility of something beyond, which could counter narrative, masculine, racialized, and gendered colonial space. I'm arguing that Thomas's artwork is reclaiming space in an urban setting, and this act of reclaiming is contributing to an alternative cartography that actively resists the colonial narrative. His photographs take the viewer through different locations in urban space to convey the message of decolonization and claim the land. His image Thomas's visual image playfully ruptures romantic notions of the Indian and through the utilization of images that are self-representations of Aboriginal people. These images become part of a larger collective memory of Canada that continues to challenge the stereotypical pictorial politics that have followed Indigenous people for centuries. The creative interventions of Thomas, Bellmore, and Houle challenge traditional cartographies by drawing on the land to tell ongoing Indigenous stories of place. This is a new way of mapping the land by imagining it as a possibility of something different. As Thomas states, you have to identify the world you live in. It is about what you see. When you look at archival material, photographs, and documents, you only see how white people saw an Indian. You don't see how they lived or viewed or saw white people. In the ways in which history is constructed impacts Indigenous people, since most cases we were written out of that narrative in order to satisfy the logic behind settler ideologies and the occupation of space. The importance of Thomas's photographs is their ability to create a dynamic reviewing or revisioning of the dominant pictorial and discursive narratives about First Nations people and places here in Canada and elsewhere in the world. Throughout this talk, I've been reflecting on the concealed geographies of urban spaces such as Toronto, and now I want to shift the focus to the city of Markham and the Markham Museum in Southern Ontario. A handful of artists in the exhibition Landslide Possible Futures, which was curated by Janine Marcia, created artworks that were critical of settler ideologies and and describe the settler relationship in Canada and the founding ideologies that affirm our national stories of ownership and the right to the land. This paradigm has been teased out more recently through various scholars, but is the earlier work of sociologist Shireen Razak that is still so pertinent. She argues, a white settler society continues to be structured by racial hierarchy. In the national mythologies of such societies, it is believed that white people came first, and it is they who principally developed the land. Aboriginal people are presumed to be mostly dead or assimilated. European settlers thus become the original inhabitants of the group most entitled to the fruits of citizenship. A quintessential feature of white settler mythologies is, therefore, a disavowal of conquest, genocide, slavery, and the exploitation of labor of people of color. In North America, it is still the case that European conquest and colonization are often denied, largely through the fantasy that North America was peacefully settled and not colonized. White settler mythologies are deeply implicated in the idea of terra nullius, which is the land that is empty or considered to be uninhabited. These mythologies and the occupation of space continue to affirm that the settler is the rightful owner of the newfound land. These mythologies continue to plague Indigenous people, since it is the above myths that are mobilized in settler cities to preserve and reproduce knowledge that affirms their ownership of this space. These stories become highly problematic for new immigrants and refugees because there is a total erasure of Canada's complicated histories, and we see this playing out in the Canada or Canadian 150 celebrations right now. Some of the landslide artists that are attempting to transform the dominant narrative are, I'm going to focus on first Jeff Thomas. Jeff Thomas's photographs confront settler constructs with whimsical self-representations of Indigenous people that are both stuck in the archaic past and visibly part of the present and future image of the city. Thomas's acts of reclamation isn't about returning to a pre-contact idea or about documenting everyday life of Indigenous folks in the city. It is instead about creating this whimsical, fantastical, complicated image that is indisputably contemporary. Whereas Phil Hoffman's piece Slaughterhouse resurrects the images of the past to drudge up his own narratives, Hoffman meets, intertwined with the National Archives and land activist Nawabekwe, landscape painter Homer Watson, and organic farmer Michael Schmidt to beautifully articulate the nuances and layers between the settler and the Indigenous narratives. My interest in Thomas, Hupfield, Hoffman, Davila and Colangelo, Sudek and Houle is that their ability to situate their artwork to challenge the grid system set up by settler culture. To focus on Indigenous scholar Mashana Goman, she argues, understanding native space as a set of connections from time immemorial thus counters the spatializing power of Western patriarchal law. Our ability to understand the connections between stories, place, landscape, clan systems, and native nations means the difference between loss and continuity. Stories in all their forms continue to bind these fragile, complex, and important relationships to each other. Stories of place illuminate Indigenous histories and relations to land in the city, and as Goman argues, these stories and relations are fragile and complex. They reflect the power relations between different Indigenous nations, settlers, new immigrants, and this is the lived situation for people within urban spaces in Canada. Indigenous stories are bound by particular histories of conquest, capitalism, and colonialism, and it is the connections between stories, place, landscape, and nations that create the conditions of native space. Issues of heritage have produced historical images of Indigenous people that have kept us in a frame that renders us frozen and voiceless. This tradition of visual representation has had considerable long-term effects. Indigenous art historian articulates the devastating implications for Aboriginal people in this context, arguing that the colonial narrative has confined Aboriginal people to the dichotomies of the civilized versus savage, heathen versus Christian, and nature versus culture. In this exhibition, we can see the work of Sudek and Terence Houle, both playing with memory, loss, and land. Houle's dark and ghostly installation entitled "There Are Things That Even a Drunk Will Never Forget" catapults us back into the time of mid-1800s, where he exposes the audience to the shady side of gang activities such as adultery, betrayal, and murder. In this work, Terence Houle demonstrates the complex relationship of the civilized and the savage is not fixed, because settlers can also take up these spaces and complicate these notions. Sudek's postcards of memories, she creates memory walks with her contested history of each of that space, allows settlers to then rethink or reimagine their relationship to their own spaces. Many of the artists in Landslide Possible Futures engage with urban environment, and a handful of the artists I've been discussing were simultaneously able to challenge the settler narrative, allowing participants or viewers of the exhibition to acknowledge the geopolitics and the historical colonial conditions. Issues of heritage become problematic when we are situated in museums and institutions that do not ask or demand the audience to become aware of the politics of existing settler ideologies. An example of these ideologies is the settler colony's recurring narrative that they are the rightful proprietor of this newfound space. This narrative is foundational to the construction of urban spaces such as Markham and plays a pivotal role in the recording of the city's history. In the Markham Museum, the reconstructed buildings represent the rationale behind the invasion and destruction of complex Indigenous societies of the Americas. The lack of Indigenous bodies in these kinds of spaces erases Indigenous people's connection to the land for thousands of years. When Indigenous bodies and knowledges are seen, the master narrative is challenged and settler ideologies are ruptured. When these bodies are out of sight, these stories remain concealed, which have real and discursive social, spatial process of evidence struggles over soil, over body, over theory, history, and saying and expressing a sense of place. In my own installation, Singing Our Bones Home, was making reference to the archaeological sites that contain 90 buried bodies in an ossuary that was moved for development. These bones stain the soils with memories, histories, and stories for Indigenous people. At the same time, they exist to teach the settler of the outstanding connection to place and land for Indigenous people. To code these bodies as part of the present and future allows for real and imagined geographies that can recreate a spatial terrain that maps Indigenous bodies into the cityscape. Museums such as Markham contain artifacts and personal belongings, and these carry and hold sacred memory and knowledge, and they create kind of a living history. However, their significance seems lost under their current presentation. From an Indigenous perspective, most artifacts are considered to be alive and need to be cared for by their home communities, not in the traditional archival sense, but in an embodied practice where they can continue to tell their stories and pass along their knowledge. This is demonstrated in Maria Hupfield's work, where she carefully recreates the artifacts and strategically places them into the archival window. She is giving life to new artifacts and at the same time reaffirming an Indigenous presence into that settler archive. When settler ideologies are perpetuated, there is a loss of Indigenous stories of place, which destroys any connection to the land that new immigrants, refugees could actually experience. If we imagine the space through different or multiple historical narratives, which will break open a place for a more nuanced view of the relationship to geopolitics of land and the occupation of space. With an understanding that history of conquest, colonialism, and capitalism, a person can open their mind to the different possibilities of space and place. Otherwise, if they do not, it is entrenched in the dominant narrative. An individual can only witness what Fanon argues is the divide between the colonizer and the colonized. Once these histories of Indigenous people are erased, the only memory left is the imperial view of discovery and ownership. This memory underlies the current political climate in Canada, perpetuated by the colonial hold on the landscape. Many artists in the show Landslide Possible Futures and the 3 artists that I featured in the city of Toronto are attempting to reflect this complex colonial relationship, asking the viewer to contemplate how these interpretations of historical narratives impact the relationship between Indigenous people, settlers, new immigrants, and is this engagement that will continue to radically rupture the settler narrative and provide a promise to a new way forward. So in my last words will be from Haudenosaunee two-spirited writer and poet Beth Brandt, as she beautifully articulates, memory is like the drum, one tap, and the sound resonates and reverberates into our very soul. One poem, one story, one painting, and our hearts and bodies respond to the message. We are here and we remember. Chimagwich.